I think that doubt, dealing with doubt, engaging doubts, and trying to bring doubts under the lordship of Christ is something that we do in terms of discipleship as well as evangelism. It's something for Christians as well as for non-Christians. And the great example of that in the Bible, of course, is Thomas. Thomas was not Judas. He was a true follower of Jesus and an eventual martyr, but he struggled with doubt. And actually, he wasn't the only one of those disciples. Tim Keller talks about this in his book, The Reason for God. He says, a faith without doubts is like a human body without any antibodies in it. People who go blithely through life, too busy or indifferent to ask hard questions about why they believe as they do, will find themselves defenseless against either the experience of tragedy or the probing questions of a smart skeptic. So when we have a doubt, we shouldn't just try to stuff it in a closet and ignore it. We need to engage it. But how do we do that? And this is my last observation about doubt. Sorry for the picture, by the way. It just seemed to fit. I don't know. Doubts are not just confusing and painful. They're not just common. Everybody has to deal with them. They're also really complicated. In other words, it's never just a matter of a good argument and then you get through it. In fact, in my pastoral work, I found almost always that's not the main thing. That's a piece of it, but almost always there are relational and spiritual and emotional and sometimes personal factors for why a particular doubt has a particular struggle and why, like de Tocqueville, it makes you melancholy. And so dealing with doubt, it's never just a matter of reading in the library. It's always related to our whole personhood. Sometimes when you're trying to help someone with a doubt, the best thing you can do is just listen and be a friend. Maybe that's what they need more at one particular time. But I also think there is a place for the intellectual side of engaging doubts. It's not just being a friend. There's a time to kind of go into the doubt and engage it and deal with it on its own terms and grapple with it and do the best that we can to bring it under the lordship of Christ. So today what I want to do is share, and this will be somewhat testimonial, kind of like my last talk. It's not a comprehensive treatment of everything that could be said about these four things, but it is kind of sharing the four main arguments or testimonies that I've found most helpful for engaging doubts, both in my own life as a Christian and then helping others in my pastoral role. I went through a time of kind of mild doubt when I was in college, and some of these, and I'll read you one of my journal entries from what I worked through and what I got to at the very end today. But some of these, it's hard. It really, you have to really do some hard work, and part of that hard work is the intellectual side and engaging them. Let me put these in the form of a question first, and you'll see where we're going today. Number one, why is there something rather than nothing? Number two, could it all have happened by accident? Number three, where did good and evil come from? And number four, could the gospel be just a fairy tale? And you'll see that I've got nothing innovative with these four. They're all just kind of the classical arguments that I put in parentheses there. But again, I'll try to share sort of in a fresh way of how these have landed on me and how I've walked through them and then helping others as well as best as I can. And I think of them as testimonies. I'm not really thinking of them as, slam dunk arguments that will convince everybody no matter what their presuppositions are. That's not how I think of it. I think of it more as kind of in the realm of Psalm 19:1, the heavens declare the glory of God, or Romans 1:20, which talks about how God's nature, as well as his existence, is known through what has been made. That's kind of the realm I'm thinking here. These are testimonies to the forcefulness, and I hope we'll feel something of the emotion of these arguments as well as just their strict force. So, hopefully this will be helpful to somebody here or somebody watching. First, number one, why is there something rather than nothing? And if you've ever taken a philosophy class, you may be familiar with that way of putting it. It's kind of a colloquial way of putting this argument. But that's one of the basic questions of philosophy, and it's one of the big questions that is kind of exacerbated by modern cosmology, because modern cosmology has shown that the universe is not eternal. Like a lot of ancient people, like Aristotle, thought that the universe had always been here. Modern cosmology says, no, space and time are relative and interdependent, and the space-time universe is finite. It came into existence at a point in the past, sometime around 13 billion years ago, and so one of the most basic intuitions that comes up, that I think even a child will ask when you consider that, is, where did it come from? You know, if it's not always been here, how did it come into being? How did that transition take place? And as I've thought about that, it's struck me that when we talk about nothing, if we say that the universe came into existence from nothing, which is a kind of a classical Christian doctrine that God made the world out of nothing, not out of some pre-existent material, it's really hard to imagine nothing. If you've ever tried to picture nothing, usually when we try to picture nothing, we picture blackness or darkness. But blackness and darkness are something. They're the opposite of whiteness and light. It's really hard to imagine nothing. I don't know that it's possible. And so if you try to intuit how the universe could pop into existence from nothing, you start to feel a little bit of kind of the wild difficulty, the incredible leap of faith that you have if you try to explain the existence of our universe without reference to something beyond the universe, some kind of cause, something beyond the universe that can explain the universe. One of the popular ways of casting this argument is the so-called Kalam, cosmological argument, which is just one form, and I like it because it's a simpler one. It just goes like this, and William Lane Craig, whom we were just talking about, has popularized this argument, I think, very well. It's a very simple argument. It just says two premises. First, if something begins to exist, it has a cause. Second, the universe began to exist, and therefore, conclusion, the universe has a cause. The formal rule of inference that's being used here is called a modus ponens, which is a very basic logical law. If you're going through like a symbolic logic textbook, a lot of times that's the first one you cover. And it's just the rule of inference that says, if A, then B. A, therefore B. So in terms of its formal validity, it's a pretty tough to say where you could poke a hole in that, and then the premises are pretty tough to dispute. The first one is pretty basic to human intuition, and the second one is pretty basic to modern cosmology. And so the feeling that comes up is, where did the world come from? There was a debate in 2009, which you may have seen on YouTube or somewhere else at Biola University, where William Lane Craig, on the right there, was debating Christopher Hitchens, who was an atheist. And Christopher Hitchens gives the standard response that you usually hear at both popular and technical level in response to this argument. And, it's the response, if everything needs a cause, well, then what caused God? I wonder if you've ever heard that response to this argument. That's a standard way. And there are various ways that people try to get around the argument. And again, I'm not trying to use it to kind of put a chokehold on the atheist in the sense of you must adhere to this, but rather thinking of it as a powerful testimony. But I think this response is the most common one, and I think it's something that can be addressed somewhat directly, because if you notice, the argument actually doesn't say that everything needs a cause. At least in this form, it says everything that begins to exist needs a cause. And there's a sense in which, if an atheist says, well, God doesn't exist, then that's a meaningful statement, but the thing that's being denied there is by definition uncaused, or probably better stated, self-caused. In other words, saying what caused God is a category mistake. It's kind of like asking how big is infinity or how long is eternity. It just applies to the wrong category. And the whole point and the whole forcefulness of this argument is to say there must be something uncaused. There must be something outside the system that can explain where our world came from. That's a bit of a technical overview, but hopefully it can help us feel something of the force that we all feel when you consider our world came into being at some time in the past. Now, some people say, and you may have heard this response too, that once we know more about the origins of the universe, then we won't need a cause. We just don't have enough knowledge yet. And they argue that the cosmological argument is basically a sort of God in the gaps argument, where you're just using God to fill in the gaps of what you don't know. And once we know more, then we'll be able to find a hypothesis other than God. This is what Carl Sagan said in general about this way of looking at the world. And it's a very powerful appeal where science so often morphs into scientism, as it were. And he says, as science advances, there seems less and less for God to do. Whatever it is we cannot explain lately is attributed to God. And then after a while, we can explain it so that it's no longer God's realm. And I've wrestled with this question of, is that what the cosmological argument is? That we just don't know enough yet? And as I was wrestling with that, the thing that helped me was coming across this passage in Stephen Hawking. I don't know if you know Stephen Hawking, but the movie just came out kind of chronicling his life. An amazing man and an amazing scientist, kind of a popularizer of science like Carl Sagan, and he wrote this book, A Brief History of Time. It's all about searching for the grand unified theory that can explain everything. And what he gets to at the very end of the book, I came across this passage and I realized, you always bump up against the cosmological argument when you're trying to remove the need for it. He says, even if there is one possible unified theory, it is just a set of rules and equations. What is it that breathes fire into the equations and makes a universe for them to describe? The usual approach of science constructing a mathematical model cannot answer the questions of why there should be a universe for the model to describe. Why does the universe go to the bother of existing? I'll never forget reading that passage where you have even someone coming from a more skeptical standpoint bumping up against the same intuition that I think everybody feels of, why is it here? Even if we knew absolutely everything about it, why is it here to be known about? And expecting that, once we have more knowledge, it'll displace the need for a creator or a cause beyond the universe is kind of like getting 2/3 of the way through a book and expecting the conclusion of the book to displace the need for an author. Because when we're talking about the cause of the universe, we're talking about something above the realm of what science can observe. What all this leaves us with, for me, is this. With each of these points, I'll frame it as kind of a pushback against the doubt that can bombard the human mind, whether it be from a skeptic or within the heart of the believer. When the doubt comes, here's an appeal to make on the basis of this argument. Our universe doesn't seem to be self-explanatory. It gives every indication of coming into existence from something else. And while it's less forceful that proves a personal God, like the Trinitarian God of the Bible, it does feel pretty odd, because the effect is usually not lesser than the cause, or greater than the cause, to think of love and relationship and the Niagara Falls and all that characterizes our world as coming into existence from some subpersonal cause. And so the question that comes up is, which is more plausible, which is more reasonable, that the universe has a cause or that it simply came into being from nothing? And that's a intuition that I've gone back to again and again. Number 2, I'll be very brief on this one. Could it all have happened by accident? This is the so-called teleological argument, or argument from design, and it has many forms. At the more so-called local level, we're talking about things like, organic life, and things here look very much like they're the product of design. At the global level, we're talking about things like the fine-tuning argument, the regularities of nature, the anthropic principle, the fact that the gravitational constant and speed of light and all these things seem perfectly calibrated to make a universe that's friendly to life coming into existence. And this is a classical argument. It was used by medieval Muslim philosophers. It was the fifth of Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways, of his 5 ways to prove the existence of God. And you may have heard of William Paley's Watchmaker Analogy, which I won't read, but you may be familiar with it. He just says, basically, if you're walking through the woods and you find a watch, you don't conclude that it came there by accident. Because unintelligent things don't organize themselves intelligently. You conclude some intelligent person made it, and it's there from that. And that old analogy still has a lot of force today, but let me read you an anecdote of sort of how this argument, again, trying to enter into the emotions and the force of the argument, of how this argument can land on someone in the midst of real time. So I'll tell you the story of this man, who's Whittaker Chambers, who was a Soviet spy, and eventually he became a Christian and argued against communism, and kind of an amazing person, amazing writer. But he tells the story of one day he's sitting in his apartment in Baltimore, and he is watching his daughter eat. She's in the high chair. And he says, "She was the most miraculous thing that had ever happened in my life. My eye came to rest on the delicate convolutions of her ear. Those intricate, perfect ears. The thought passed through my mind. No, those ears were not created by any chance coming together of atoms in nature," the communist view. "They could have been created only by immense design. The thought was involuntary and unwanted. I crowded it out of my mind. I did not then know that at that moment the finger of God was first laid upon my forehead." I think this argument is very forceful, probably for different people in different ways, but I do think whether it's looking at your daughter's ears or looking at the stars or whatever it might be within our own sphere of interest and our experiences, all of us have moments where we look at the world we inhabit, and it's very, very difficult to suppose this is all the product of a big accident. There's no design behind it, no teleology, no purpose. Now, some people claim that the appearance of design is simply the product of evolution. They say our perception of design in the universe is part of what helped our ancestors survive. Together with all of our religious and moral inclinations, this is simply the product of natural selection. Daniel Dennett says, we value God for the same reason we value sugar, sex, and money. To help people survive. And Darwin himself lost his faith in the teleological argument. As he put it, the old argument of design in nature as given by Paley, which formerly seemed to me so conclusive, fails now that the law of natural selection has been discovered. And this is a response not to be dismissed too quickly, but to be engaged in. Here is what helped me, and reading it was an experience. I remember the day I read it, and it's the section in The Reason for God that says the clue killer is really a clue. And Tim Keller is arguing, and he just nails the problem here, where he says, if we can't trust our belief-forming faculties to tell us the truth about God, why should we trust them to tell us the truth about anything, including evolutionary science? In other words, there's an inconsistency here, where if you say, well, all of our beliefs are there just because they helped our ancestors survive, what about our belief about that? And if you apply this scalpel of skepticism to our religious and our moral inclinations, what about our scientific? And so if the argument proves anything, it proves too much. And so the way I've put this trying to engage the doubt from the skeptic or the doubt within the heart of the believer is this. Let's say there's 2 different ways of looking at the world. Which is more satisfying, both intellectually and existentially? Number 1, the universe is an accident. And therefore, time plus chance plus matter is what produced everything that exists. Therefore, love and beauty and art and friendship are sort of glitches in the system, so to speak. They just came about because it helped animals survive. Love and beauty did not exist in the past, and they won't exist in the future. in the heat death of the universe, they'll just swallow them up. They may not have existed. And therefore, when you're falling in love with someone, the feeling of transcendence and significance that accompanies that is ultimately an illusion. There is nothing transcendent connected to love. When you're listening to a beautiful strain of music, the feeling that probably every human knows of what music can do to you, the feeling of transcendence that accompanies music is ultimately an illusion. And when you're reading a story and things like courage and sacrifice are held up as honorable and transcendent, that feeling is ultimately illusory. All of that is just because it helped animals survive. Second way to look at the world, no, these things, love and beauty predate the world. Love and beauty are the explanation of the world. Love and beauty are the purpose of the world. When we experience love and beauty, we're tapping into what is at the heart of reality. And you and I were created specifically to experience the ultimate love and beauty, the very glory of God, forever and ever and ever. Which way of looking at the world is more satisfying to heart and mind? Number 3. We're appealing to all the great theologians here, including Homer Simpson. Are good and evil objectively real? The moral argument. Now, when we're talking about, excuse me, the cosmological argument and the teleological, we're talking about, testimonies of God in the natural order like the stars, things that you study within the purview of science. I think those things fall into the category of Romans 1. The things God has made reveal God's existence and, in fact, His nature. For example, His eternality. And here, I also think, though, that those kinds of testimonies do not exhaust what Romans 1:20 is talking about. I think you can find testimonies for the reality of God within the natural order and study them with a microscope or telescope, but I also think you can find testimonies for God within psychology and poetry. I think you can find testimonies for God within the human heart. I think that also fits within the purview of Romans 1:20. Kant spoke of the starry host above and the moral law within as testimonies for God. I think there's something to that. God's left a lot of clues for Himself. He doesn't just reveal Himself to us in one sphere of life. He's kind of pervasive throughout all of our experiences. And one of the examples of this would be the reality of good and evil deeply imprinted upon our consciousness, what a lot of times we call a conscience. Now, one of my favorite books of all time is called That Hideous Strength, and it's by C.S. Lewis. It's the third of the Space Trilogy. And there's a scene in that book where the character Mark is imprisoned and he experiences a kind of psychological torture where he's put into a room. They're not trying to make him feel physical pain. They're trying to drive him crazy. It's the bad guys who get him. And, he's put into a room, for example, where all the chairs are slightly asymmetrical. There's all these dots on the floor, and they almost correspond to the dots on the ceiling, but then there's little variations. So he finds himself looking up and down furiously, trying to figure out, what's different. There's paintings on the wall, and they're all famous historical paintings with little aberrations, like there's the Last Supper he's looking at with all the disciples eating, and there's a bunch of beetles under the table. And it's kind of dark and gross and weird, but as he's experiencing this torment, psychological torment, he has this experience where he discovers the power of the objective idea of good. And it says, as the desert first teaches men to love water, or as absence first reveals affection, there rose up against this backdrop of the sour and the crooked some kind of vision of the sweet and the straight. Something else, something that he vaguely called the normal, apparently existed. Day by day, as the process went on, that idea of the straight or the normal grew stronger and more solid in his mind until it had become a kind of mountain. It's a great picture of something deep within the human awareness, that there's something good that cannot change, even if I don't have access to it, it's out there. And I think one of the ways we see that is in our movies. Movies are our culture's form of storytelling. All cultures tell stories, and movies tell you a lot about human beings and about culture. And if you think about it, all movies are dealing with good and evil. Every movie is in some ways repackaging the same basic plot outline where you have good and evil struggling and vying against each other. Usually good is losing for most of the time, and then good wins at the end. And almost every movie we watch tells this again and again and again, so much so that we don't even notice it. But if you stop and think, you think, why is that there? Why do we do that? A lot of times the good is the underdog, whether it's David fighting Goliath or Rocky Balboa fighting the Russian. A lot of times the good is institutionally disadvantaged, whether it's the Israelites languishing under Pharaoh or the rebels fighting Darth Vader. And a lot of times good triumphs over evil through sacrificial love, whether it's the gospel or whether it's Will Ferrell in Stranger Than Fiction jumping in front of the bus to save the child. There's infinite variations, but it's the same thing happening over and over again. And in other words, movies are never just about different parties struggling for power. There's always a moral dimension to the struggle. And you have to ask, well, where does that come from? And we feel in our hearts that there's something right about good winning at the end. In The Lion King, which we just watched with our kids a little bit ago, when Simba dethrones Scar, nobody just thinks, well, Simba got lucky, I guess, could have turned out either way, whatever. We think it's right that good won and evil. When in the movie Runaway Jury, when Gene Hackman is alone at the end in the bar and he's kind of got a wild, chaotic look on his face because he lost, you sense there's something right. There's a sense of resolution with that. And it raises the question, why is that there? Because the naturalist, the evolutionist, has to look at that and say, again, that's just helped our ancestors survive. There's nothing like Mark discovered, like a mountain that's objective about good. Now, a lot of times the skeptic would respond and say, well, not all movies have a happy ending. And that's true. And I've written a lot about this movie from 2011 called The Gray, and I won't say much about it today because I don't want to give any spoilers about it. And I can't recommend it. It's kind of dark. But I want to reference it because it brings up the struggle very forcefully. The book is all about death. It's all about nihilism, the philosophy of death, and about these oil men who are stranded in Alaska in the wilderness, and their plane crashes, and they're getting hunted by wolves, and they're going down one by one. And the basic message of the movie seems to be something like, death is all there is, so go out with a bang. That's kind of the philosophy of the movie. It's kind of like the poem that Dylan Thomas wrote, do not go gentle into that good night. It's kind of defy things. And I won't say much. I don't want to give a spoiler. I'll just say, if you do watch it, watch through the credits to the very final moment after them. Because it is amazing to me, and it's a testimony to what Kant spoke of as the moral law within, that even movies advocating for nihilism cannot help but relapse back into things like meaning and happy endings, and borrow from those worldviews to tell a good story. Because nihilism doesn't really even give you the tools to tell a good story. If all you have is just a random succession of events with no overarching moral structure to it, that would not get a good score on Rotten Tomatoes. It doesn't make for a very good story. It's not very emotionally satisfying. And the very forcefulness of the tragedy of nihilism makes you wonder, maybe there's something else. Why is that there? In this scene, this character, Liam Neeson's character is crying out to God, saying, so he's the last one, everybody else is dead, and he's saying, God, why don't you help me? And no, there's no answer, and it's very touching, it's very tragic, but it raises that question in my mind of why is it tragic? Why is there such an emotional disturbance with the thought that it's just death? And this is what C.S. Lewis expressed in terms of his own conversion, and it's why I think that the problem of evil as an argument against God ultimately backfires, and it's one more testimony to God. He says, my argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust, but how had I got the idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. you can see this struggle in some of the language that's used by some of the new atheists, for example, in the way they argue against God on the basis of evil, because they appeal to that same forcefulness that you feel when you're watching a movie and you see it depicted. For example, in River Out of Eden, Richard Dawkins tells the story of a bus full of children, a Roman Catholic school bus, that crashes and all the children die. And he says, if the universe were just electrons and selfish genes, meaningless tragedies like the crashing of this bus are exactly what we would expect, along with equally meaningless good fortune. But it's a good example of the struggle here, because I always look at those words, meaningless tragedies. And it feels a little bit like an oxymoron to me, kind of like saying jumbo shrimp. If it's meaningless, why is it a tragedy? That's the struggle. That's the way this backfires on you. The more you appeal to the forcefulness of the problem of evil, the more you've got to try to explain, well, why is it evil? If you have only a closed system and natural causes working that produces everything, you have to ask the question, why can we stand in judgment upon anything that happens? Whether it's a Venus flytrap liquidating a bug or genocide, the strong devour the weak. It's just what, and you can't get an ought from an is. If this is just what always happens, why can we stand in judgment on it? And yet, we all know, we feel in our hearts there is such a thing, like Mark discovered in that book of good and evil. I'll end this third point, by just another reference to literature. Again, I find the most forceful expressions of these testimonies can sometimes come in the arts rather than in formal logic. I read a book, The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky, towards the end of our time living in Washington, D.C. I listened to it on my bike because I don't have the patience to slog through so many pages. But if I'm riding my bike, I can just listen to it. And a lot of people don't know that that book was interrupted in the writing in 1878 by the death of the 3-year-old son of Dostoevsky, whose name was Alyosha. Same name as the hero of the book. And it makes it more vivid when you get to this one scene in Book 5, chapters 3 to 5, where the character Ivan, who represents atheism and rationalism, is giving an argument against God, and he's saying God cannot exist because of, look at all the evil in the world, and he especially appeals to the suffering of children. And you're reading this speech, and you know the author's son just died. And you feel the forcefulness of the argument. And you're thinking, is this what Dostoevsky himself believes? Because that speech gets no answer that I can discern in the rest of the book. There's not a single actual logical response to it. And you're thinking, okay, is that the truth that Dostoevsky is putting forth? Keep reading, and that philosophy that Ivan espouses is the justification for the great murder of their father that drives the whole plot. And when Ivan realizes my philosophy led to that action, he goes insane. And the hero at the end is Alyosha, who represents faith. And what it looks like Dostoevsky is doing is proving the problem, the challenges that face the problem of evil, not by giving it a logical response, but by showing how it doesn't work. And appealing inwardly to the sense, we know that can't be the case. Look what happens. It's shown wrong through narration, not through argument. And there's this scene, I remember, for me, it's where it hit me, reading at the end of the book when Alyosha is praying for his brother. And it says, he began to understand Ivan's illness, the torments of a proud decision, a deep conscience. God, in whom he did not believe, and his truth were overcoming his heart, which still did not want to submit. Alyosha smiled gently. God will win, he thought. He will either rise into the light of truth or perish in hatred, taking revenge on himself and everyone for having served something he does not believe in. Alyosha added bitterly and again prayed for Ivan. And the appeal to doubt that I make from this argument is, all of us must struggle at times in life with the problem of evil. But if God is not real, why is it such a struggle? And do we not feel deeply, inwardly, that good and evil are more than something that just helped our ancestors survive. Lastly, again, be brief on this one, but could the gospel be just a fairy tale? Let me just reference a scene from literature again that helps express this. If you've read the Chronicles of Narnia, you may be familiar with this scene from the Silver Chair. It's my favorite scene in the whole books, and it concerns my favorite character, Puddleglum, where basically, if you haven't read the book, this character and two children are underneath the earth in this underground kind of realm, and there's an evil queen who's trying to convince them that the overland, what she calls it, where the sun and grass are, don't really exist. They're just a figment of your imagination. You just dreamed them. And Puddleglum responds by saying, "One word, ma'am. All you've been saying is quite right. I shouldn't wonder. So I won't deny what you said, but there's one more thing to be said even so. Suppose we have only dreamed or made up all those things, trees and grass and sun and moon and stars and Aslan himself. Suppose we have. Then all I can say is that in that case, the made-up things seem a good deal more important than the real ones. Suppose this black pit of a kingdom of yours is the only world. Well, it strikes me as a pretty poor one. We're just babies making up a game if you're right, but 4 babies making up a game can make a play world which licks your real world hollow. That's why I'm going to stand by the play world. I'm on Aslan's side, even if there isn't any Aslan to lead it." Now, as I have reflected upon this argument, that's a helpful expression of, again, the emotions of it and the appeal of it to the heart. And it really is a struggle to think that if, supposing that there is nothing beyond nature and naturalism is true, then what that amounts to is that the ideas in my brain, say the idea of God or the idea of heaven, these things, in a sense, are more weighty than the whole world that brought my brain into existence. And it's kind of tough to believe that. It's kind of tough to believe that that's the only, and the beauty of Christianity to my heart makes an appeal, again, kind of thing of different realms and spheres of life. The realm of desire here, at the realm of the longing for fulfillment. The beauty of Christianity meets the need in a way that I can't deny. And there's one time I'll share with you, as we're nearing the end here today, that I felt this especially. And it was when, of all things, I was reading a biography of Albert Einstein. I didn't read the whole thing, but I was just interested in his views on God. And there's a chapter in Walter Isaacson's biography called Einstein's God. And he tells the story of Einstein being interviewed just before his 50th birthday. And he was asked, "Do you believe in God?" And this is his answer. "I'm not an atheist," Einstein said. "The problem involved is too vast for our limited minds. We are in the position of a little child entering a huge library filled with many languages. The child knows someone must have written these books. It does not know how. It does not understand the languages in which they are written. The child dimly suspects a mysterious order in the arrangement of the books, but doesn't know what it is. That, it seems to me, is the attitude of even the most intelligent human being towards God." As I read that, I thought, on the one hand, I can really appreciate something of the sentiment there, of just the awareness of our own smallness and our finitude and our struggle to understand everything. On the other hand, it brought to my mind the beauty of the claims of the gospel, because what the gospel claims is that the librarian showed up, in a way, to pick up the metaphor. That God hasn't left us in the dark to figure it out on our own, but actually He stepped into our world and come down to our level, and above all, in the person of Christ, actually become one of us. So that the one who made all those stars, in this metaphor, the one who wrote all those books, actually showed up and came into our world as a helpless baby sleeping with the donkeys in a manger. And, one day every knee will bow before Him, but He also was put on a cross and made the object of absolute shame and discrimination and hatred and mockery and finger-pointing and absolute depths of agony. And there's a power in sharing your testimony, so I'll just say, the beauty of that claim grips me, and I just cannot deny it. And so the appeal to doubt on the basis of that claim is, if that is not true, it is surely the most beautiful story that has ever been told. And if that is the case, it seems awfully strange, as Puddleglum would put it, that our story is less weighty than the real world. So, to sum up, I find Testimonies to Christianity in the fact that it enables me to embrace some of the most basic intuitions I have at different levels of my existence as a human being. It tells me that we didn't come from nothing by accident, for no reason and to no end, but rather we came from somewhere, we're here by design, the struggle of life is deeply meaningful, and there is ultimate fulfillment. Let me leave you with an anecdote just from my own life as I was in a time in college wrestling with doubts. I wasn't like rejecting my faith, I was just kind of feeling angst about it. And in the throes of it, I had a breakthrough. And I wrote this out in my journal to try to capture something of the breakthrough, and I want to read this passage to you, and then I'll be done. This is what I wrote. Why does anything exist at all? Why is there something rather than nothing? The very fact that we're here to ponder the question is already the greatest miracle, the greatest improbability. Unless theism is presupposed, all thought and all action becomes absurd. Unless the infinite exists, the finite would never have come to be. What sense does the painting make unless there is paper on which it is drawn? God is the great truth, and we are His dream. Or you could put it as Albert Einstein put it, the child knows someone must have written those books. Thank you for listening.